behalf of Senator Cardin, Chairman of the U.S. Helsinki Commission, I'd like to welcome you all to today's briefing on Russia's Muslims. We are pleased to have two world-renowned experts on the topic. And this is the last official event the Helsinki Commission will hold this year. This event will be on the record and transcribed, and will be posted on our website, and I think a video feed on YouTube, and there will ultimately be a transcript. So hopefully go at a leisurely pace and not be interrupted, as we often are when the Congress is in session, by the annoying buzzers, and not as pressed for time. So please, as you're out there listening to the presentations, be thinking of good questions. There will be certainly an opportunity to participate, hopefully in a discussion about a topic that's quite relevant, and I would say quite misunderstood. Islam in Russia is something that I get the impression is not terribly well understood in Russia, let alone here in Washington. And it's something that there are clearly policy relevance given a number of issues in Russia: religious freedom, the radical Islam, terrorism, demographic issues as far as where the community is growing. But it is, as I think we'll learn from the presentations of our witnesses, a type of Islam unlike what we may be a little more familiar with coming out of the Gulf or out of Iran, but certainly having some commonality as well as an influence from abroad. There are a number of centers of Russian Islam, the North Caucasus being one of the largest ones. The city of Kazan, which was in the news when Secretary Clinton visited, because it was the city she visited outside of Moscow, and remarked there on the relative inter-religious, inter-ethnic harmony that exists in the Republic of Tatarstan. Not necessarily the case in some of the southern regions. As well, of course, the two big cities of Moscow and St. Petersburg, which have sizable Islamic communities. And as far as briefings go that we hold, it's a little unique in the sense that we're often holding a briefing or a hearing on a crisis, the war in Chechnya, free media under siege in a particular country. Whereas this one is not being held on any particular crisis at all, but on a community, an interesting community, and I hope our discussion today will have a certain academic flair to it, in a sense, something you might almost expect from a college lecture. So, but hopefully an interesting one. So with that, we will begin with Professor Paul Goebel, who is currently a professor at the Institute of World Politics here in Washington. Has held a number of senior government posts over the past few decades, including at the Central Intelligence Agency, the Department of State, USIA, or
Voice of America.
Voice of America.
For Europe.
Pardon me. Radio Free Europe.
Absolutely.
Thank you. So we will begin with you, Paul, please.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to have this opportunity to speak on this subject, and I wish to commend the Commission and staff for organizing it, and I'm very grateful to have the chance to appear before you. I have been in the nationalities business in Washington for 35 years, and one of the sad things is that despite the increasing importance of the various parts of this community and other ethnic and religious groups in what was the Soviet Union, many of them remain largely unstudied, and indeed within the U.S. government, large numbers of them are referred to as orphan communities, by which people mean no one is paying attention to them. We tend to wait until there's violence, and one of the consequences of that is that we associate small groups only with violence rather than with a much more important historical and political tradition. 2 years ago, Elena Chudinova, a Russian Orthodox children's writer, published a remarkable novel which sold very well in the Russian Federation. It was called The Mosque of Notre Dame de Paris. The premise of this novel was that in the year of our Lord 2048, Muslim radicals had taken over the European Union. They had imposed Sharia. They had confined the small number of remaining Christians in ghettos that were guarded by Palestinian radicals. And these communities could only be rescued by the daughter of a Jewish oligarch from Russia, a dissident Catholic cardinal from Beirut, the Israeli governor of Baghdad, and 6 Serbs who hated Europeans. This was, all the buttons were pushed. But one of the reasons I mention this is that in fact this novel, which was supposedly set in Europe 35 years from now, in fact has nothing to do with Europe in 2048. It has a great deal to do with how many Russians misperceive their own future and the population, which is radically changing. No one knows exactly how many Muslim believers there are in the Russian Federation. All figures are problematic. Indeed, even if you ask Muslim leaders, they will explain to you that only Allah knows the answer to that question. Typically, we talk about Muslims and we give numbers in terms of what are called ethnic Muslims, that is people who are members of communities that are historically Islamic. Some of those people are Muslims in a belief sense, some are not, but culturally most of them are part of a Muslim tradition. If you count that way, there are already in the Russian Federation somewhere between 20 and 25 million people of Islamic heritage. That number is growing rapidly, both in terms of absolute numbers and relative to the total population. Its relative growth is powered by 3 things. First, fertility rates among historically Islamic peoples are vastly higher than they are among ethnic Russians by factors of 3 to 8 times. In other words, the average ethnic Russian woman today has about 1.1 children per lifetime, whereas the average Chechen English woman has about 10. Even if you assume regression to mean over generations, that still gives you a big outcome. Second, because of the incredible alcoholization of the ethnic Russian population, you have unprecedented levels of adult mortality among ethnic Russian males between the ages of 18 and 55. Indeed, it has been said that an ethnic Russian man is more likely to die the next year from alcohol-related problems than a man living in Afghanistan or Iraq. It is that. So you have a big death rate. And the third thing is you have massive in-migration. There are somewhere between 12 and 14 million people in the Russian Federation who come from former Soviet republics that were historically Islamic. It is projected by the Institute of Ethnology in Moscow that within the next 10 years there will be more Muslims in the Russian Federation from the near abroad, that is from the former Soviet republics of Central Asia and Azerbaijan and the Caucasus, than are native born. That has an enormous consequence because it means that the usual Russian insistence that the Muslims of Russia do not pose the same kind of challenge to the Russian state that the Muslim populations in Western Europe do goes out the window. Because the people who are coming in as migrants speak a different language, have a different cultural tradition, and have a very different set of attitudes toward the Russian population within which they live. So that a lot of the assumptions that govern the discussion in the Russian media in the past have to go out the window. What I want to do today is 3 things, and obviously it would be impossible to cover even one of those in the next 4 hours, and I'm not going to take even that long to talk about all 3. First, I'd like to talk about the inheritance of the Muslim problem, or the Muslim issue after 1991. What caused things to be the way they were in 1991? Why were Muslims organized, and why were they particularly open to certain kinds of movements after the collapse of the Soviet Union? Second, I want to talk about what might be described as the perfect storm of events that happened in the 1990s and subsequently. Because we really see something happening in the former Soviet space, something happening in the world of Islam, and something related to the demographic change that has made the Islamic challenge, if you will, within the Russian Federation far more severe now than anyone expected 15 years ago. And the third thing I want to do, because this is a U.S. government operation here, is to talk about the implications for policy. The fact is that the rise of the Islamic communities, and I think we should say plural because there are many of them, it's not just one, inside the Russian Federation, has already provided some important policy challenges to the United States, many of which we have not dealt well with. I'm going to specify some of the places I think we've been very wrong. And second, they pose some very serious challenges to us in the medium term because a lot of our expectations about what a Russia is are going to have to be changed. And third, they provide an occasion for reflection about something that we Americans have tended to ignore as a challenge, namely, how do you treat a rising social force which is going to come into power because it will remember how you treated it before it got there. And we should remember that when you mistreat people or you allow others to mistreat them without challenging that and they come to power, they will not forget that. The first thing to say about the inheritance of Islam is that Muslims came into the Russian Empire in all the ways that Muslims came into anywhere. Some of these areas were conquered. Derbent in the south of Dagestan is one of the oldest mosques in the world, dating to within 50 years of the Hijra. Others came in by migration. Others were communities that were conquered. At one point, there were more mosques in what is now the Kremlin than there have ever been churches, because the Kremlin was built as a Mongol outpost. On the other hand, it is worth noting here that the Russian mythology about the Tatar yoke or the Mongol yoke is mostly alive because it serves certain nationalist purposes and is rarely challenged. To wit, it is said that it was the Muslims who took Russia for the Mongols. In fact, when the Mongols conquered Russia, they were not Muslim yet. They were Nestorian Christians and Hazarite Jews. It was only 2 generations later that they changed. And so the idea that the Muslims took Russia out of Europe, or the Christians and Jews took Russia out of Europe in the way that the Horde did, is not fair. It's also important to understand that for the last 1,000 years, Russia and Russians and Muslims have been locked in a very complicated historical embrace. The Russian national hero, Alexander Nevsky, for example, who's usually held up as the Russian national symbol, in fact was an ally of a Muslim power against a Christian power, which is conveniently neglected in the discussion of him. We don't have time to do that. All right. When the Tsar's authorities moved south and east and began taking over historically Muslim areas, Catherine the Great in the 18th century created the ancestors of what are called Muslim spiritual directorates. It was an effort on the part of the Russian imperial government to create institutions to transform Islam into a church. One of the big problems that Westerners and Russians among them have is that they can't deal with a religion that doesn't have a clergy and a structure. And so what we have seen is an effort on the part of the Russian state and the Soviet state, and indeed even to this day, to create official structures that would give a hierarchy to allow better official control. These institutions, which we'll have occasion to come back to several times in a few minutes, never fully captured the entire Islamic community. What they did, however, was to divide Islam between what has been frequently called official Islam and unofficial Islam. Official Islam is that which is part of the Muslim spiritual directorates. It is tightly controlled by the state most of the time. And unofficial Islam, which is not controlled, which is underground, and which comes to be viewed as politicized as a result. When the Soviet government took over in 1917, 1918, the Soviet authorities, in their own atheistic program and a religious program, destroyed more of the Islamic community than they destroyed anyone else. 99% of all mullahs were killed who were alive in 1918 on the territory of the Russian Federation, and between 97 and 98% of all the mosques were shut down. That doesn't mean they weren't used, but they were officially shut in. the ability to recreate a Muslim spiritual directorate in the late 30s and early 40s, and was profoundly limited. And it is significant, and this is something that you should all remember when talking about Russian Islam. Unlike in Christianity, unlike in Judaism, the organizations of Islam have never been centered in Moscow. They've always been kept outside. The central Muslim spiritual directorate was in Ufa, and there's a reason for that. It was to keep it away from the foreign embassies of Muslim countries. Now, that system began to collapse in the late 80s. And the collapse of the Soviet Union, I can say very quickly, we in the West, we in the United States, look at the way in which the opening of the western border of the Soviet Union, former Soviet Union, and the Russian Federation played such a great role, just of course marked the death of Yegor Gaidar and the role he played in transforming that part of the world. But we tend to forget the extent to which that other borders opened as well. And I'm prepared to argue that the opening of the border to the south of the Russian Federation may ultimately play a bigger role in the transformation of this area than the opening to the west. That's for three reasons. First, it took place at precisely a time when you had the Islamist revivalist movement, the Al-Sharia movement, wanted to go back to basics. It came at a time when, thanks to the anti-religious efforts of the Soviet state, large numbers of people in Russia, in Islam, in the Russian Federation, knew they were Muslims but had no idea what that meant. One of the people I've knew in my career was Jogar Dudayev, the first president of Chechnya, Korea, before he was murdered by the Russian authorities. President Dudayev once told me, Mr. Goebel, I'm a good Muslim, I pray 3 times a day. Well, a good Muslim prays 5 times a day, but Jogar Dudayev did not know that because he had been a member of the Communist Party from the age of 18 and a major general in the Soviet Air Force. Large numbers of Muslims in the Russian Federation were people who had never had access to a mullah, never had a chance to read the Quran, never had a chance to have religious education, never had religious broadcasting, and therefore had a very cloudy and very imperfect view of what being a Muslim meant. And the Russian government was not unhappy, or Soviet government was not unhappy about that, to a certain extent the Russian isn't either. But Islam, among its other qualities, is obsessed with oneness and correctness. And therefore, people who had the chance, for the first time often in their lives after 1981, to get a true measure were prepared to listen. This split the community precisely because, with the collapse of the Soviet wall to the south, we have seen over the last 20 years the most amazing growth of Muslim institutions in the world, right here. To give you a very short compass, let me just list 4 pairs of statistics, one for 1991 and one for 2008-2009. In 1991, there are an estimated 150 to 180 mosques on the territory of what is now the Russian Federation. This year, there are 8,800. It's a pretty big chunk. In 1991, there were 40 Muslims from the Russian Federation who went on the Hajj. This year, there were 25,000 who went there officially, and 40,000 total. It's 15,000 people without checking the authorities, 15,000 additional. The number of missionaries coming in and providing a particular view of what Islam meant, 0 in 1991. It's been running over 1,000 a year since then. Many of them facilitated not by Iran, but by Turkey. Again, we'll talk about that. And perhaps most important in terms of changing views, the number of Muslims studying abroad at Muslim universities like Al-Azhar and the Madrasas, Southwest Asia and South Asia. In 1981, there were 4. It's currently just under 1,000, but it ran as high as 1,800 in the late 90s. More than 22,000 of those people have returned. So what you have is suddenly people are getting religion. And something all of you know, who've had experience with religion, is that missionaries tend to be rather more dogmatic than other people. The kind of people who are coming in and telling people what Islam means are not people from your Unitarian church. These are people who have a very doctrinal commitment. This is split Islam in many places. And at the same time, this was happening, splitting the Islamic communities. And one footnote on that. One of the biggest mistakes of things you will see in articles and books about Islam in Russia is the Western imposition on this area of the assumption that people know the difference between Sunni or Shia, or between the four legal schools of Sunni Islam. I live in Azerbaijan, all right? And I will tell you, in Azerbaijan, which is 2/3 Shia, 1/3 Sunni, people do not refer to themselves as going to a Sunni or Shia mosque. They go to a Persian mosque, or they go to a Turkish mosque. But the idea that people understand these theological distinctions is simply wrong. And that, having a corollary to that, is that the assumption that this is all about doctrine in terms of how people behave because they're Muslims is a huge failure of imagination on our part. When we talk about religions we know something about, we talk about practice. When we talk about religions we know little about, we talk about doctrine. And we make the mistake of assuming that everybody does what the doctrine says. Whereas in our own lives, in our own practice, we know that isn't true. My wife and I happen to be Catholic converts. We go to Mass every Sunday at 7 a.m. because they don't sing, they're shorter. And you're supposed to go every Sunday. 50 weeks out of the year, we can go in at the 7 o'clock Mass and lie down in the pews because there are so few people you could go to sleep. But 2 weeks of the year, there will be all of the people that will show up and you have to get tickets to get into Mass, which is Christmas and Easter. We all understand that. When we talk about Islam, we fail to understand that much diversity, not only within doctrine, but in terms of obedience to doctrine. And this is a huge, huge mistake, which I urge you to avoid. Now, the other thing that's happened, besides the expansion of foreign influence and people recovering their identity, is that we saw the wars in the North Caucasus. I want to insist very strongly that the Chechen movement in the 1990s had nothing to do with Islam. Dzhokhar Dudayev was a secular nationalist who believed that Chechnya had every bit as much right to be independent as Estonia, where he had earlier served. What happened, unfortunately, is that the people who were ethno-nationalists were largely killed, and because of the events of September 11th, it became very convenient for the Russian government to accuse anyone it didn't happen to like and wanted to suppress as being Muslim. This willingness to accept this idea that the Russians are accusing people of being Muslim, and therefore it's legitimate to go after them, has only encouraged the Russian government to accuse more people of being Muslim and being Islamist fundamentalists. The consequence of that is that the Islamist fundamentalists are getting the benefit of those charges. When you are in an ideological conflict, as a war on terrorism inevitably is, it is the case that a group that can say, we're being blamed for this, therefore we take responsibility, are in a position to pick up support that other people couldn't, and that's generally forgotten. Now, very quickly, there's so much more to say, but let me, because I want to be fairly close to my 15 minutes, let me make 3 points about American policy. The reality is that the United States government historically has known almost nothing about the Muslims of the former Soviet space, and even less about the Muslims of the Russian Federation. And the amount we know is probably less today than it was 25 years ago, simply because of certain political assumptions about the way things are going. Tragically, we have allowed ourselves to be trapped by our commitment to support the central government in Russia. The beginning of this was in October of 1993, after Boris Yeltsin used the highly original and democratic means of prorogating his parliament by firing tanks at it. The mayor of Moscow, Ryzhkov, issued his infamous order to expel persons of Caucasus nationality. It's Kafkaskaya nationality. Not only did the United States not condemn that, the United States went to its allies in Europe and told them not to criticize it either, lest it undermine Boris Yeltsin. The consequence of that has been an increase in racism and the opening door to the Chechen War. Second, we have been unwilling to face up to the real challenges that are there. We have not understood that Russian policy toward Islam has often been extraordinarily hostile. And it is not surprising that Muslims are angry. But we have not taken the trouble to make the distinction between objections people have because they are Russian citizens who happen to be Muslims and objections people have because they are Muslims. We have assumed that if you are a Muslim, that is the basis of your objection. Many of the complaints that you get in the North Caucasus have nothing to do with Islam, but they are invariably interpreted as such both in Moscow and in the West. And that's a huge, huge mistake. A bigger challenge for us, however, looms, and that is, first, there is not going to be a time when a Russian government that faces the current demographic reality is going to line up with us on the Middle East, on all of our policies. They simply can't. As many of you know, beginning in 2008, the Russian government had to adjust its draft policy so that it drafted more heavily in ethnic Russian areas than in ethnic Muslim areas because the percentage of 18-year-old males who are of Muslim heritage is too high. Moscow is already the largest Muslim city in Europe, and Russia is going to be increasingly Islamic over the next decades. Exactly what that means is an open question. Second, you need to understand that Russia is prepared to be incredibly repressive toward Muslims. If you doubt that, please read Mr. Rogozin's statement of yesterday, Russia's ambassador to NATO, who said that there needed to be an alliance between the Americans, the Europeans, and the Russians against the threat from the South. And there was no question as to what that threat was. It's Islam. And when you look out, you're going to see that the Russian government, in facing a situation whereby 2025, 2030, perhaps half of the population, or at least a plurality of the population, will be of Islamic background. That doesn't say believers, but Islamic background. There are going to be pressures in Russia in three directions. One is repression, an autocratic regime. Second is to let parts of the Russian Federation go, which many Russians may not be able to prevent. And the third is a desire on the part of some Russian government to absorb Ukraine and Belarus, because a Slavic state that includes Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus will not have a Muslim majority until sometime in the 22nd century. And there are too many people in Washington who would see that as a reasonable reason or justification for selling out Ukraine. But this brings me to where I want to end, and that is this. All of you know that in the Middle East, in the Arab countries, the United States is well thought of generally by the governments and hated by the population. And Iran, the reverse is true, where the government hates us, but the Persian people do not. It's worth asking yourself why this is so. The reason it is, in the case of Iran, we won't go to the Arab Republic, is the following. Most of the people who are in the current Iranian government were either followers of or themselves victims of those who were tortured by the Shah's regime. That regime was rather uncritically supported by the United States. It is not surprising that they remember how they were treated before they came to power. This is not to say that the United States or any country should not resist violence, should not oppose terrorism. It is to say that we need, in thinking about what we are going to do as a country, to pay attention to the possibility that some of the forces we may not like are nonetheless going to come to power. Many of our problems with the Russian Federation in the 1990s came from the unmitigated hostility to Boris Yeltsin of the first Bush administration. Let's be blunt. That's one of the reasons we have problems. And I think we also need to understand something else. And that is this. Islam, by its nature, is not necessarily ineluctably hostile to the rest of the world, nor is it true that the more people know about Islam, the more hostile they will become. The reality is that in Islam, the more people know, the less hostile they're going to be. The danger to the Islamic communities in the Russian Federation are precisely that they were kept from knowing very much for so long. And the greatest reason I have for optimism about the future is that more and more of these people are reading the Quran in Russian or in their national languages. All of us know that in the West, the world was transformed when the Bible was translated into German and into English in the 15th century. We are now watching the Quran cease to be an Arab-centric vehicle in the way that it was only a generation ago. As more and more people learn about Islam, the ethical qualities of the religion will come to the fore, I believe. And therefore, it is not necessary that we have to accept the current problems as being inevitable and forever. And if we learn about that, we learn about Islam, we take it seriously, and we see this as an interactive process rather than flowing from the sixth sword of the Quran, as some people would say, then I think there can be hope, not only for us in dealing with the future of this part of Eurasia, but also for the Russians who can deal with a ethnic community of which they are ineluctably a part. And if that happens, then all of us, the Russians, Muslims of this part of the world, and the United States will be far better off.
Thank you very much, Professor Gold. We will now turn to Dr. Shireen Hunter, who is a professor at Georgetown School of Foreign Service, as well as the author of more than 7 books and countless scholarly monographs and articles on Islam in Russia and the politics of national identity, including her book, Islam in Russia, the Politics of Identity and Security, which I definitely need to read. And as well, Dr. Hunter has been a consultant to the U.S. government on these questions, and we're very pleased to have you here. Please, your remarks.
Thank you very much. It's always very hard to follow Paul Gogol in any kind of panel because he presents everything so well and in such a cogent way, and his knowledge is so vast that it really doesn't leave anything for other panelists to say. So I have a really big challenge, and so I'm going to try to fill in some of the points that maybe Paul didn't have time to cover. First of all, I think one of the things that we have to understand that Islam was present in what is now part of the Russian Federation far before Christianity came to Russia. For example, the Bulgar kingdom, which is on the Volga, which is actually, I visited the city of Bulgar, which the Tatars now take pride on. And it was a very nice boat ride on the Volga to go to Bulgar. Existed before actually Vladimir accepted, finally made Christianity the official religion of Russia. Secondly, as far as the Caucasus is concerned, now, certain parts of North Caucasus did not become Islamized until quite late, like 15th, 16th century. But places like Dagestan and obviously the Southern Caucasus, they became Islamized very early, around, definitely towards the end of 7th century, but definitely by 8th century, Islam had penetrated those parts. Again, even before the so-called Mongol invasions, Mongol Tatar invasions, which were devastating many parts of the world, and including parts of Russia, brought down the Kiev Rus state. However, missionaries were coming from Bukhara and Samarkand and so on, and as a result, in areas of in the Volga-Ural region, like in Bashkortostan and so on, Islam was beginning again to gain roots by 9th century and definitely by 10th century. So I think this is something that we have to quite understand, that Islam had very strong roots there. But another thing that we have to understand is that Islamic ethnicity somehow is conflated in the Russian Federation. In other words, most of, although now you have some Russian converts and so forth, but that most of the Muslims are also non-ethnic Russians, or they are non-Slavs. And although there are some Tatar Christians and others, but this is something that, particularly when we talk about problems, and I think that what Paul was saying about the whole Chechen conflict and Islam's role, was it a motivator or later on became a legitimizer or whatever, is very important. I submit to the same theory that this was more of a kind of a nationalist thing, particularly if you look at the history of Russian conquest of Caucasus. The people that resisted most were the Chechen and actually Dagestanis, Avars, because Sheikh Mansour, Sheikh Shamil, they were both actually Avars. But you can't really, I mean, there is tribalism there, so you can't really distinguish that much between Shamil and the Avars and the Chechens and so on. So that element is also very important. So when the Russians often talk about the threat of Islam, well, on the one hand, obviously, when they talked about threat from the south, essentially because even Kozyrev used to talk about threat from the south. On the one hand, I think it was because they wanted to find a common ground with the West, saying that we face the same enemies. But the other thing was also that they wanted to reestablish their suzerainty over these regions within a variety of things. And as a result, to say that our desire to bring these countries back in our orbit is because we are facing a security threat from them, and therefore Islam was a very convenient thing. The other point that I would like here to say, I take a little bit issue with this apocalyptic, in my opinion, things about the Russian, the number of Russian Muslims and how they are going to. A more detailed study of also, for example, mortality and so on, and child mortality among the Muslim women, you also see, however, that the child mortality and so on is higher among Muslim women than it is among the Islamic women. And why is that? That has a lot to do with economic conditions. And here again, I think that the economic conditions is also related quite a bit with the potential attraction of some of the youth of Muslim Muslim population of the Russian Federation to a more radical, Islamist ideologies. You see, for example, that Tatarstan. Some of the statistics in this book obviously are old and one has to go, I think, but the basic facts that they show hasn't really changed in the 4 or 5 years. For example, when we looked at the, for instance, average of wages in Muslim inhabited areas, and let's say that national average. In places like Tatarstan and to some extent Bashkortostan, which are all industrial regions of all the Ural region, the average wages were much closer to the national wage. And as a result, although Muslims still were at a lower level, you could see this in Kazan, maybe now has changed, but several times that I visited Kazan, when you went to the Muslim quarters, then you obviously everything became, and in addition to the fact that there was a land speculation, everybody buying and building villas, and all the kind of Muslim fabric of old Tatar Kazan was beginning to disappear, which is in my opinion very sad. But anyway, but you can see immediately it would drop. You go visiting Marjani Mosque, the neighborhood was just delinquent almost, but other parts, derelict rather, not delinquent, sorry. So I think this is also very interesting to note. Now, when you look into the South, what the Russians call South Russia, they call it North Caucasus. Now, this becomes absolutely, the economic conditions is, I would say, that below misery level. Prior to even during the Soviet times, there was really no industry, much of industry that we done. Agriculture was of what they call it the kitchen variety, mainly that people grew stuff for themselves. And the wages are way, way below the national average. Unemployment is incredibly high. In Dagestan, including there was an interesting recent report by ICG, which was quite interesting. Unemployment among the youth and so on is about 50%. Now, in the meanwhile, there is a criminal class which is related with government and so on, which is getting very wealthy, even in very poor areas, partly because of either stealing including stealing. For example, a lot of people in Chechnya are getting rich by stealing oil and then selling it, I don't know, black market or whatever, and crime and all these other things. But when you look at the living conditions in, say, places like Ingushetia or Kabardino-Balkaria and all these places that are getting, you're having more violence and so on, I think that we should keep in mind this whole incredible economic conditions that is absolutely, terrible. The other thing, frankly, is that the whole Chechen situation, I'm not going to, so by and large, when you look at Tatarstan and Bashkortostan and those parts, and even in places like Siberia and so forth and so on, you don't have really a big problem of Islamic opposition or Islamic fundamentalism or whatever. Tatars, particularly Yeltsin, for some reason, was willing to cut a deal with Tatarstan, although Putin, took away a lot of the concessions that Yeltsin had made to Tatarstan, including for them to be able to manage their own budget and so on and so forth. But relatively, because there was a nationalist movement, there was a Islamist movement, much stronger in Tatarstan in 88, 89, and 90, 91 than there was in Chechnya at the time. Chechnya was one. But Yeltsin, first of all, made two mistakes. One, he went to Chechnya and told, I think, Dudayev or some other people, take as much sovereignty as you want. Well, if you're offering me sovereignty, I would be fool enough to take it, right? But then later on, then he went back on his word. More importantly, unlike the case of Tatarstan, where, as they say, it was, a solution by treaty, and as a result, nothing really big happened and whatever. In Chechnya, he didn't take that route. For some reason, I was told, and some other people know, I don't know what Paul you think, but that for some reason that the Yeltsin took a dislike to Dudayev, that he didn't want to talk to Dudayev. But be it as it may, and I think that to a great extent, here I have to add that given the poverty and so on, the Chechen conflict became a crucible for both external influences. I agree 100% with Paul that for a while anyway, the word Wahhabi had become a sort of like, they used it, any Muslim that Russians didn't like was a Wahhabi. Now, having said that this word was much abused and misused, one should not nevertheless forget that there were groups that came, particularly what they call the Afghan Arabs and so on and so forth, and used Chechnya and wrote these new visions of Islam that basically was in conflict with the more Sufi traditions of the Caucasus, including Chechnya and Dagestan and so on. Now already you have the Islamic fratricide. They were during the Chechen War conflicts between the Sufis and Salafis and so on and so forth. All these Jama'ats that are springing up, these are not, the point is that, if the Russian government misbehaves, doesn't necessarily mean that these Jama'ats and people who are joining them are good either. So, this is a big problem. But one of the reasons that I applied, to be honest with you, I think Putin, instead of celebrating the Winter Olympics in Sochi, should have invested more in Ingushetia, in improving people's lives, investing a little bit in other places, and so forth. Now, Islamic extremism in this part also is directly related to the repression and corruption in particular of the local elites as well. The corruption and repression is just out of this world, and I think that that is going to be a big, relatively speaking, Tatarstan still is better run because it's more, but also Kazan and so on was a center of. The other thing that I believe is troublesome eventually for Russia, I think that during the 90s, I think, during Yeltsin, and maybe later on a little bit, there was an effort really, I think, perhaps at least an effort, to try to create a more multicultural Russian identity. Because, I mean, if the person that started this commission to talk about Russian identity, who are supposed to be now Mr. Sarkozy, is also having a commission on French identity. Again, because of Muslims. But the fact is that he started this question of, at that time there was some hope that this Russian identity would be a more multicultural, along democratic lines and so on. And the government was beginning to develop relationship with this new structure of various Muslim spiritual boards and so on and so forth. And there was a process of at least the legitimization of the presence of Islam in the public square and so forth. I think that the problems of Chechnya, I think that initially affected Russians very much. Again, here I'm not going to say where the original sin lies and, you know, empires and so on. It's very difficult, one doesn't know. But I think that it would be a mistake to underestimate the traumatic impact of the Chechen war, and particularly the terrorism that spun out of this Chechen war, particularly, for example, the hostage taking in the exactly the theater and so on the whole Russian, you know, the ethnic Russians, if I can put it that way. And unfortunately, by that time, many Chechens have abused Islam. Dudayev himself, I agree, Dudayev didn't know. I mean, he was, but early on, Dudayev started putting the green banners and zikr and so on, so they made it. And even today, with Russian, let's say, Kadyrov is basically using Islam to legitimize his rule. And if he cannot give them economic well-being, he's giving them the biggest mosque in Europe. Now, so the politicization of Islam in general has not taken shape. The government, the federal government uses it, the local governments use it, and the opposition uses it. And this is, I think, it's going to become difficult. The other problem, however, is that basically what is the status of Muslims in Russia? Muslims in Russia, I would not go as far as saying, I mean, I think that they are essentially on many levels still second-class citizens. Again, I apply a variety of things to that. There are now one or two Muslim billionaires and so on, but they are sort of shady characters. Of my experience, you know, those days in Kazan and people that I saw that were relatively wealthy, they were, you know, really like in American level was of a small kind of business type. They were not in industries and so on. They had some, you know, like restaurants, they owned some restaurants, they owned some small, you know, businesses and so on and so forth. So economically, Muslims are definitely on the bottom of the line. And now, if you go to the Caucasus region, then that is, as I say, it's a misery. You don't have to talk about, so you just have to look at misery, and that's all. On the political level, Russian Muslims historically have always wanted to have some form of self-government. Therefore, every time there have been an opening, Russian Muslims have asked for some degree of autonomy, political. Yeah, so you see, for example, in 1907 and so on, during a period of opening, Muslim political parties developed. They aligned themselves with democratic parties, like cadets and so on in Russia. They wanted to be involved. The same thing was happening, you know, and I think that early on during Yeltsin and so on, there were some efforts at least to create that. But then when Putin came to power, with the new election laws, for all practical purposes, eliminated the possibility of even a local Muslim party. Because any Muslim political party had to have offices at least in 40 federation subjects. And this is impossible because Muslims are concentrated. Yes, there are Muslims are everywhere, in Kamchatka, in Karelia, everywhere they are. But I mean, they are small communities. Officially speaking, relative, one has to talk. Officially speaking, in certain parts, including in Moscow and so on, the official federal government policy and big things, notwithstanding the Moscow mayor taking this, you know, Azerbaijanis and others, yes, out. Relatively speaking, he had been good to Muslims. He was the only one that, yes, Dushma. He was, for example, the only one that allowed, when Muslims wanted to celebrate the 1400th anniversary of the coming of Islam, the federal government wouldn't provide them a venue to hold the ceremony and invite them. Bushra provided them with it. So I have to look at some bright spots. Now, there is a different story when it comes to how the local governments deal with it. And there you have a lot of tales of woes about, anyway, what I'm saying is that it's a very mixed picture of even the government handling of Islam. On the one hand, for example, you see in a highway from Moscow to Nizhny Novgorod, they have roadside praying places. On the other hand, now they want to sell a mosque because some company that owned the mosque has gone bankrupt. So it's really very, when you read all this stuff, that websites, Islamic website, you get a different story. Some of the problems also is that Muslims of Russia are not united. So, I think that in any calculations of the Muslim influence in Russia's future, you have to understand that Muslims of Russia are not united. Ethnicity is a big trump card, and in Tatars and Bashkirs hate each other. This is reflected in the relationship between the two chief muftis, Ravi Ainuddin and Tajuddin and Bashkir, and I like Ravi Ainuddin much better. He's a more stable, more knowledgeable person. I met him. Tajuddin is the word, I don't know what.
He's the drunken mufti. He's the only mufti in the history of the world that opened a mosque by taking a bottle of champagne and saying that he was christening it when he drank the champagne.
Exactly. So I rest my case. Now, this is very important. But the other thing that here is very sad in some ways, but as Paul mentioned, this is really the result of the Russian-Soviet treatment of Islam. Because the Soviets particularly, but the Tsars did their share, but particularly, they essentially destroyed the indigenous intellectual, religious capital of Muslims of Russia. So what this meant that, in addition to that, during the Soviet time, you had the parallel Islam, that illiterate mullahs just trying to get something, or Sufi brotherhoods. But it also meant that the official Islam was looked upon the same way that in the Arab worlds. Sheikh al-Ajlan doesn't have much authority because he's seen as a bureaucrat. By the same token, and I witnessed this, by the same token, the official clergy, let's be at Republican level, oblast level, or higher, don't have that much. Ravi Ainuddin has some because he's a reasonable person to some extent. As a result is that a lot of the freelancers, the younger ones that are coming back from Saudi Arabia and so on, with new ideas, which is fragmenting the Muslims, because the Russian Federation Muslims, except for Dagestanis who are Shafi'i, are Hanafi. They are coming with that. The other thing is that, frankly, I have to say this unfortunately, the other thing is the websites. You have now on the websites, you can get videos of fire-breathing sheikhs and with subtitles in Russian. I have seen this myself. So I think that Russians are going to have really an Islamic problem. But my opinion is really not so much of that the Muslims are going to take over the whole population, is going to disappear or so on. It's just going to be whether they're going to be able to contain and are going to have the wisdom to do things to eliminate some of the causes of Muslim disenchantment. And the main, I suggest, challenge is in regard to the North policies. That is the really Achilles heel. Obviously, immigrants and so on and so forth are causing also their own problems. But the other thing is if they can change their mindset. But that is a far more difficult thing to change because, as I say, it's not, look, even Armenians who are Christians or Georgians, because they are dark and dark-haired and darker skin and so on, they are attacked because they think they are Muslims. So this is not only a religious thing. It is, I think, that unfortunately, the conflation of this both race and religion that is giving it a problem. And the challenge ultimately is Russia going to be able to become democratic and multicultural and develop an identity based on citizenship, or when some of the issues that Paul raised and so on could become bigger and bigger and more problematic.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hunter. Thank you both for very interesting presentations. At this point, we have time for participation, questions, comments. Normally, we're pressed for time, and we have to keep your comment or your question limited to a question. But because we have a relatively intimate audience today, I think we can be rather informal and question, comment. Something, and there's a mic over. There are a few mics or one mic? There's one mic. There's one mic over there. So I would just ask that you might identify yourself, because for the record. And do we have anyone who'd like to?
Ron McNamara with the Helsinki Commission. Thank you very much for the insights that you provided. If I could run through a few points and get your reactions. One, I guess visions of sort of the Soviet of nationalities, I think it was during the Soviet period, this structure that showed the diversity of cultures and ethnic groups in the Russian Federation, but was largely a sort of a showpiece and perhaps a means of managing those various ethnic groups in the Russian Federation. I wonder what your sense is in terms of Putin's, and I guess we have to say President Medvedev extension, understanding of Islam in the Russian Federation. Are they mainly seeking to manage the issue? Is it sort of divide and conquer, trying to keep things a bit separated along the ethnic lines? I find governments generally deal more readily with hierarchical structures where they can deal with one person, as opposed to sort of this more decentralized approach, which is harder for governments basically to manage, if you will. And then I wonder, in terms of, you were talking about right up to the end of the Soviet period, not much understanding of Islam amongst nominal Muslims, maybe in the Russian Federation. So where are the clergy being trained who are leading these various communities? For example, in France, we see an attempt, or the French leaders sometimes talk about a French Islam. Is there an attempt by the Russian Federation officials to try to inculcate some kind of, or do they need to? Maybe they don't even need to. And then I know that there's been some issues, shall we say, pertaining to the upcoming census in the Russian Federation. Wonder if you could address the questions of religious identification and how those will or will not be addressed in the context of the upcoming census.
Thank you. Please.
Okay, I'll work backwards. 2 days ago in Rostov, there was a big meeting on how the census will be conducted with respect to the questions of nationality and religion. There will be no religion question. It was discussed in 2002 in Rostov, but none of the so-called four traditional religions, Orthodox, Islam, Judaism, Buddhism, their organizations, Kirill put together in his earlier incarnation, wanted to question. One of the reasons nobody wants to question religion is that it's becoming painfully obvious that the Russian government, Mr. Putin in particular, is simply lied through his teeth about what the percentage of the population that is historically Orthodox. It's not 80%. It's not anywhere close to 80%, and a census would show that, so they're not going to ask that question. With respect to nationality, the issue is much more sensitive. As the census was being worked up, one of the questions was that the Constitution, 93 Constitution, requires that people have the right to declare their ethnicity or not declare their ethnicity. That meant that a census taker could not demand someone to declare his or her ethnicity. The problem with that, of course, is that if some size percent of the population doesn't declare its ethnicity, how do you allot them in terms of calculation? So there have been issues about the nationality line, that's anonymous in the upcoming census, is the only one where a census taker cannot write it down, but has to have the person write it down, which will also have consequences of distorting the relevant. And that's anonymous is the only thing that cannot be gotten out of official documents. In other words, if someone refuses to participate in the census, which people always do, you go to the official documents in many cases and get this data. You're not allowed to get that. Now that is not clear. This is the Rostov discussion 2 days ago. It's not clear how far you can go. The idea of creating a distinctly Russian Islam. Islam is every bit as diverse as Christianity. Within Russia, it's every bit as diverse, both doctrinally and in terms of attachment to doctrine. There have been people who talk about Russian Islam. There's an organization called NORM, the National Organization of Russian Muslims, which is the ethnic Russian part. Shireen's absolutely right. There are very few. It does tend to run along ethnic lines, but it is not nearly as perfect as it used to be in that regard. There are lots and lots of Tatars who are Krechcheni, who are Orthodox Tatars. There are lots and lots of people. The intermarriage by ethnic Russian women with Muslim nationality men, those people are re-identified. And one of the missionary, Father Sosoyev, was just killed, probably by someone who wanted land under his church rather than by a Muslim fanatic, now appears. He got in trouble for writing a rather nasty book that said no good Russian woman should ever marry a Muslim, and went on. It was really pretty ugly. But he was not the hero he was made out to be. There is no clergy in Islam. The people who are the mullahs or people who are communicating information, many of them were trained abroad, or, and Shireen's quite right, being trained through the internet. Lots of that. One of the interesting things, the Mufti of Karelia up near Finland is a former Palestinian medical student who came to Petrozavodsk 30 years ago, nearly, married a local Polish-Russian woman who converted to Islam. She's in charge of public outreach for that Mufti. You can always count that Petrozavodsk will be, after Moscow, the second largest pro-Palestinian demonstrations in Russia that happens. With respect to Putin and Medvedev's understanding, I think there's a huge difference in understanding religion between Putin and Medvedev. Medvedev, thanks, I think, largely to his wife, is very, very interested in religion and very much a believer. She is. His wife is absolutely committed, very close to the patriarchate. And Medvedev has said some things which reflect an understanding of faith. Putin, I think, is instrumental. That is to say, religion is something we use for political purposes. And I'm not seeing anything that Putin has said or written that suggests a deeper understanding even of Orthodoxy, let alone Islam. I think it's an instrumental view, it's something to use or play. With respect to representation in government institutions, the Soviet nationalities, of course, was like almost all Soviet government institutions, decorative, not real. But it had symbolic value. Personality seats in parliaments, however, on ethnic lines did matter. In Dagestan, which was run like Lebanon, where you assigned a certain number of seats to the Avars, certain to the Lesbians, and so forth, that kept stability going. It was a very effective system. It was very effective until Vladimir Vladimirovich, probably with the advice of the Americans, said, oh, but that's not majoritarian democracy. We should let the majorities run. So when the majorities run, what happened is the Avars took over. All the groups that had had seats in the past were forced, or many of the groups that had had seats in the past were forced out, and then you got instability. It wasn't that it was unstable when you had a quota system. It became unstable when in the name of majoritarian democracy, and with respect, I think Putin only understands democracy as an instrumental value, only in a majoritarian sense, not in terms of protecting minorities. Then it became unstable. Is it a smart idea to make sure that all groups are represented? Yes, it is. One of the things that has just happened this past week, which is very, very discouraging, is that there's a proposal to cut the size of the legislative bodies in all of the Federation subjects. In other words, they will be in the 20 of the 22 non-Russian entities inside the Russian Federation, the size of the legislatures will be cut. As you cut the numbers down, what you will do is inevitably the smaller groups will be disenfranchised.
But is this all of the subjects or just 20 of?
No, 20 of the...
So not the 80?
No, they're 80. They're 83 now that with the consolidation. Those roughly 20 are non-Russian.
Right. So
of those that are non-Russian, about 12 to 15, depending on the count, are Muslim. All of those will see the size of their legislatures reduced.
But none of the Russian constituents.
Some of the Russian ones will see theirs reduced as well. Some will see them increased in size. There's a formula, there's a 4-part formula that's going to be proposed depending on population. When that happens, if for example, in Dagestan, you cut the size of the parliament from 70 members to 50 members, the reality is the smaller groups are going to be disenfranchised. The reality from that is that some of those people will be radicalized.
A couple of things. I mean, on the question of nationalities under the Soviet Union, and the problem was that the Soviets were kind of in a bind. Because on the one hand, the whole concept of Soviet Union was this socialist utopia was that all these ethnic, religious, and other bonds are going to disappear, and the new sort of almost Sovieticus is going to emerge. One of the reasons the Soviets were so much against Islam and much even harsher than Christianity, because they saw Islam also as enveloping and in fact in its vision as totalitarian, as socialism, because there's also a homo Islamics. You see what I'm trying to say? At the same time, they had to keep this vision that Soviet Union was not the empire, the colonial empire, which it was, and that it was a republic. So they, in a paradoxic way, actually, Soviet Union helped to develop national identities that frankly did not exist as such. I mean, they were local identities. You were from Samarkand or Bukhara or Khojand or Kharazm or whatever, and then you had an Islamic identity. They more or less manufactured Kazakh, Turkish, and with national operas and I mean all kinds of historic revisionism and so on and so forth. And then this, of course, backfired on them. Now, problems that existed, the other things that I think now probably the Russians may come to regret. Just during the time where the Bolsheviks were fighting, for they gave all kinds of promises to Muslims. And a lot of Muslims actually bought into this. They were Sharia squadrons and so on, fighting alongside of the Red forces and so on. They had already plans which Russians had accepted at the time, would have solved many of these. They had the idea of Idel-Urda, republics which combining Tatarstan and Bashkortostan, because Bashkirs are essentially Tatars. The Bashkir was a dialect of Tatar, and the Russian Soviets made it into separate language. Now they are like, they don't get along with one another. Then also there was the idea of a North Caucasus Federation. But as soon as they won the war, they went into a policy of miniaturization. Problems are extreme. There are a lot of the non-Muslims, ethnic Russians in some of these North Caucasus republics that they feel disenfranchised. Because, for example, in places like Karachay-Cherkessia or Kabardino-Balkaria, whatever, actually titular nationalities that the republics are named after them are form a very small minority. So the Russian Federation is still bedeviled with this very terrible nationalist politics that the Soviets had, which essentially was miniaturized and keep rival groups together so they constantly fight, and as a result move to the center for protection. You see, and Putin in Georgia is doing the same thing with South Ossetia and all these other things. So I think a lot of things. Now on the census, one of the issues that I think that once was raised was the whole question of classifying of Tatars. because after the ethnic Russians, Tatars are the largest minority. However, there was plans, and I don't know whether they did it, Paul would know this better. They wanted to divide Tatars now. They identified them as subgroup, Kazan Tatars, Tatars in Siberia, Tatars this and that, which would then eliminate Tatars as a whole second largest ethnic population.
This was led by Tishkov, and he was pushing the Kryashchen, the question as to whether the Orthodox Tatars are, in fact, that was the big one, because the real numbers that would cut the size of the Kazan Tatars is to take the Kryashchen. The Siberian Tatars, what happened in 2002, I mean 2002 census of total fraud, but what happened was that you could declare you were Siberian Tatar, and that was to be recorded. The issue was when that data was coded, whether Siberian Tatars would be listed separately or not. And the point that as the data got out, the official census accounts did not list them separately, but then the government subsequently did, so that you have two. That's why it was confusing.
Yeah. So I think that there is a lot of these things. Still I think Russian Federation is kind of really still coping with the legacies of the Soviet era, and how they will deal with it or not. And on the question of Russian Islam, there is some of the Russian Muslims themselves identify like this the intellectual, I have his name is Hakimov. He talks about something called Euro-Islam. But by that it means a very reformist Islam, Islam that is, it's that some of the Muslim reformists are saying that it's a more of a Islam as a religion, not so much politicized Islam. But at one point there were efforts, again, which became very controversial, and everybody disliked it, that that the government had to decide, for instance, what should be the content of the sermons, the Friday sermons, and so on. By and large, my own observation is that what the Russian government would like is a quiet system. They don't mind so much if Muslims practice religion, as long as they don't stake any economic claim. They don't stake the sort of first-class citizenship claims. That is really ultimately. But the problem is that is also what the locals are doing as well. Shahir would not countenance an independent mufti any more than Putin does. Now, one thing on the situation of mosques, when we look at the numbers, we think that, oh my God, 8,800 or 1,000, whatever mosques in that. But we can look at what these mosques actually, some of them are. And, I have seen some of this. It's like, maybe like a quarter of this room is the mosque. And it has no minaret, no nothing. It's a tiny little thing. And in some of the villages, and then, they say, I went to a lot of these schools, and when you read it, the lists of here, they said that we have, we have computers. I mean, I could see who had the money, who didn't. Some communities who did have the money. Muslim schools that they were showing as like showcase, the computers didn't work. They were all junk. They were not connected. This school was pathetic. It was not connected. So I think that in general, there is a lot of excessive thinking about, about the whole. And I think a lot of it comes from what Paul was saying about this problem of falling birth rate in Russia. And you have the same feeling you have about China. The Chinese are going to come and take all the,
Could I
yes.
three footnotes? First, the 8,800 number is a good number, that there are 8,800 places in the Russian Federation which are called mosques, that all of them are very active or very large and very small. That the reality is, and this is the important thing, the Russian Orthodox Church insists on how many thousand churches it has. It usually gives a figure between 12 and 14,000. Well, last week there was a discussion on missionary activity which pointed out that in a majority of the Russian regions, at least 10% of the churches that were claimed as churches had no services at all, and so that they were being held for property. The second thing is Raphael Hakimov, who's the director of the History of the Academy of Sciences in Kazan, and also former advisor to Mizmer Shemia. His Euro-Islam is worth noting in another connection, and that is one of the. I mean, I don't feel sorry for the Russian government at all. The fact is that the most modern, the most progressive, the most thoughtful and interesting Muslim writing in the whole world at the end of the 19th century and before 1914 was coming out of Crimea and Kazan. And that was nearly totally destroyed. Those people were killed, those books were, one of the things Akim was trying to do is to reprint those kinds of things that were published before the war.
They were part of the movement, people like Marjani and so on. They were part of the reformist movement of the 19th century with Sheikh Abdo and others also in the Middle East. And there was, and with Jadid, all sorts of things. But Paul is absolutely right that Kazan was a major center of Muslim reformism, but also other things. And obviously those, before the takeover, obviously, of Ivan, Ivan the Grozny, the tale of how much things were destroyed in Kazan is just amazing. It's just amazing. And it was the Reconquista was very brutal.
It's also worth noting the numbers. There's another thing here. Russian fears about the declining Russian birth rate and the declining overall Russian population, massive deaths in adult Russian males, the rise of immigration, and the fact that now more than 60% of Russians say they want to block immigration permanently, the fact that the percentage of ethnic Russians is declining like a rock and will decline further if the census isn't, if it records it to be true. But there's something else that's happening that has never been true in Russian history. Up until this generation, when ethnic Russians married non-Russians, the progeny almost 100% identified as Russian. That's no longer true. That now what you're having is ethnic Russians marrying non-Russians, and not only is the ethnic Russian who's marrying in often changing his or her identity, but the progeny are almost always going in the direction of the non-Russians. That is a historical shift of such enormous consequences. The fear that's deeper than the numbers. One of the reasons Sysoev got so much attention is that he called attention to the fact that a few years ago there was some ethnodemographic data in the city of Moscow that showed that roughly a third of the ethnic Russian women getting married in this particular year in the city of Moscow married Muslim men, and that almost all of them re-identified to the ethnic group and converted to Islam, and that all their children were Muslims. Now the consequence of that is that you have the sense that your own identity is slipping away, and that is an existential fear, which is why Sysoev got so much attention when he was killed.
Please.
Benedict Bernstein from Center for Relations. I have a couple of questions. So one is, to what extent has the issue of Islam in Russia played into Russian-Chinese relations? Second of all is, how has the encounter with Islam in Afghanistan scarred or affected current stances towards Islam in the Russian government? Finally, you mentioned that the vast majority of missionaries or people coming in to teach Islam in the Russian world were from Turkey.
The Turks have facilitated.
The Turks have facilitated. Can you talk about what effect that's been having? Obviously, doctrinally, the theories of Turkey's kind of the break between Europe and Asia, and how that can be, and then also how that, what politically speaking, why Turkey became so interesting.
Okay, I'll say very quickly. Turkey, Turkey facilitated the departure of most of the people from the Russian Federation who received Islamic education abroad. They flew from Maykop into eastern Turkey, where they met with consuls from Middle Eastern countries who gave them visas to go on. Turkey, the American simple-minded notion of the first Bush administration was that Iran was the threat of producing Islamic fundamentalism, and Turkey was going to bring liberal democracy and free market capitalism. Well, that was a nonsense. As anyone who's visited Baku knows, where the largest bank is the Bank of Iran, and the largest mosque was built by the Turkish government. It isn't that Turkey itself is the source of such, of such ideology, although there's some of it. Some would say that Gulenista is part of that, although that starts getting really complicated. But that the Turks also are playing a balanced role. Yes, on the one hand they have one foot in the West, but on the other they have a foot in the Middle East. And increasing in the Middle East. I think we misread, we've assumed Turkey is fixed, and I think that's a huge error. With respect to Afghanistan, 3 quick points. The first is the Russians are terrified by the way in which the French French ability to get the EU to put money into building that wall that meant that the drugs go north, not west, has now produced an enormous drug problem in Russia. It's staggering, and the HIV/AIDS issue, all kinds of things that flow from that. They're very worried about that. With respect to Taliban, I think a lot of Russians take the view the Americans are finally getting theirs. There was an op-ed not long ago that said, look, the Americans helped plan this against us, and then now they're having to deal with it. That was in the New York Times, but you could read that in August too. I think Afghanistan is something the Russians see as a tar pit in which the United States is caught, and I don't think they're entirely happy about that. I think they're only too pleased to offer the good, to give their good offices to help as a way of weakening suffering. With respect to Islam and Russia-China relations, I think there are 2 points I'd make. One is, no country on earth was more unhappy with the end of the Soviet Union than China. Because as long as the Soviet Union existed, somebody controlled Central Asia. As long as somebody controlled Central Asia, Xinjiang, Eastern Turkestan, was less of a problem. The peoples of Central Asia and the peoples from Xinjiang are some of the same ethnic groups, so that cross-border stuff is a huge problem. So when Russians look at Muslims and the Turkic movements, they see that as a cross-border, it's sort of the Chinese. This is all going to heat up because China is moving into Central Asia in a big way. While the Americans are worrying about Central Asia as only an American-Russian game, the team that's clearing the board is China. They're getting the oil, they're getting the gas, they're getting control, and they're only too pleased to support the highly authoritarian but very brittle regimes in Central Asia. So that's what I think very quickly.
I just will add a couple of footnotes. The one thing that we also have to realize that Turkish policy in general, even before the AK came to power, was what, in a way, the old Soviets used to do. What was the state-to-state relations, and Turkey was the modernizer, and one is a different thing. One of the groups that has been very active in Central Asia, and they were very active also in the 90s, early 90s in Bashkortostan and Tatarstan, is the Fethullah Gülen movement. And you see, Turkey was seen far more dangerous by many Russians because it combined un-Turkic tendencies and appealing to that, and there was some of that. And so now a lot of some of these groups will constantly get expelled and what have you. And so that has been the activities of Gülen movement in general. There has been an issue. Also, you have to understand that Islam for Russia has been a kind of a double-edged. On the one hand, they have threatened, including by the Muslim population and so on. On the other hand, they have used their Muslim population as a way of gaining influence in the Islamic world. Khrushchev did this, that's why you had a lot of the ambassadors to Arab countries were from Muslim republics and so on. Now Russia is an observer member of OIC. And so that, in a way, this can be, they can use this for a positive thing. in regard to China and Russia, they have used this so-called Russian, Muslim threat. I mean, that was essentially behind the Shanghai Cooperation, organization, and what have you. And of course, the Chinese are doing all kinds of things to the Muslim minority that under the guise of fighting terrorism and what have you. They are doing it, in some ways, even worse than the Russians were doing.
And they've got a lot more Muslims. There are 150 million Muslims in China, which is a huge population. It's not all in Xinjiang. It's further
They
east.
wouldn't admit that.
I'm sorry?
They don't admit that.
No, their censuses are even more dishonest than the Russian ones.
It's interesting, all this discussion on the census has me thinking, one of the things that the Helsinki Commission is quite involved in is election observation. And so often the elections in Russia and in some of the neighboring countries are frankly not that interesting. And it almost seems that the monitoring of the census could potentially be a more fruitful operation, given how this data will be used. It seems to me to be a far more interesting problem. Of course, the census is going on, seemingly away from any.
One of the things that one would love to see the U.S. Congress do is to beef up the Bureau of the Census's Center for International Research, which is the arm of the census that monitors. Murray Feshbach was associated with that for many years. Following the census is very, very tricky. And next year's census is going to be really tricky because it turns out that something like 24 of the regions of Russia are having elections on the same day that the census has been scheduled. So the possibility of having the census conducted on the day that you have an election in some places, but not every place. And then the issue of whether there's actually enough money, because the amount of money for the upcoming census has been cut at least twice. It's about 60% of what the original amount was now. And whether anything can, the 2002 census was totally fraudulent because the Russian government, after it surveyed 66% of the population, announced it had no money to survey the rest of them, and therefore it would use the files of the Interior Ministry. What that did was to overstate the number of people who were in groups before, who were declining in size, and understate the size of the groups that were increasing. So that allowed President Putin to claim that the ethnic Russian population had fallen only by about 1% since 1989, where in fact it probably had fallen 6%. There are other issues. It's a huge issue. It's something we perhaps have a good hearing on, is whether you count people who are physically resident or only people who are citizens, whether things are required. And there is an issue that is right on the table now. One of the reasons the meeting was held in Rostov the day before yesterday is that there is a proposal from one of the national republics to make answering the census mandatory and failure to answer to be a crime. Now, if that goes through, then that changes the nature of the answers you get. The question is whether or not that is congruent with the Russian Constitution and also with Russia's obligations to the European Union, which has rule, or to the Council of Europe, the agreements they have having to do with what kind of personal data you have to supply to officials or not. So it's a huge issue, and you're absolutely right. It has been one that has been neglected compared to modern elections.
The problem is in general in Europe also. I think it's not just for Russia. I think that this has a lot to do with the economic changes, but also changes of attitudes, and particularly women's issues. I mean, for example, in Spain, 30 years ago, average child for a Spanish woman was like between 6 and 8 children per woman. Today, Spain has negative birth rate. In most of the places, the only country in Europe that still have relatively positive birth rate is, I think, France. So in general, I think that, and so one of the reasons, it's not like only that men, but alcoholism also making Russian women infertile. The other thing is that certain practices, women having had so many abortions, even young women cannot have children. And so that a lot of the societal things in general, in the Western Europe also is facing these problems, which has to do with economics and socials, and if one can put it, moral with a small m kind of things. That there are some practices that it may sound initially good, but it has repercussions.
Well, if Rostov is to be believed, the Russian State Statistical Committee, last year the fertility rate of Russian women, all ethnic groups, was exactly the same as the fertility rate among women in Italy. 1.1 something, I forget what the third digit is, which is half of replacement level, which is 2.24 children per woman per lifetime. The difference is, however, that the population decline in Russia would not be what it is if that were the only factor. What's much more important is the massive, super high mortality rates among ethnic Russian men. And while all of the fertility rates are coming in, if I can just give you one demographic reality, there are 3 stages of demographic change, which are described along an S-curve. In traditional societies, people have a lot of children because most of them die in childbirth. In modern societies, people have very few children because they live in cities and they don't need the kids to keep them in their old age, although with our deficit we may change that. But in between, you have people where people have values of having a lot of children, but you bring in penicillin. And what happens is people have the 10 children in generation A, but instead of 8 of them dying, only 5 of them die. And so you get these vast growth rates. This led to that's why nationality studies was created in the United States, because a lot of people did very foolish projections based on the 59-70 intercensual period, which were not sustainable, because what happened is what you'd expect. Once people get used to the idea that half of their children are going to survive, they will adjust the total number of children they're going to have compared to only 20% of the children are going to survive. And then there are always weird people like me practicing to be a newspaper. We have 3. So, screw the statistics. But what we watch, and this is true in every population, is that intergenerationally you get a decline. In other words, 10 children to 8 to 6 to 4. But, and this is my point, if you have people in North Caucasus who are having 8 or 10 children in this generation, if they have 6 in the next one, 4 in the next, you multiply 8 times 6 times 4, that is a very different outcome than if you multiply 1.1 times 1.1 times 1.1. And one of the things that's really frightening in Russia today is that the Russian government lacks the resources to pursue a successful pro-NATO policy, which is very expensive. So they have no interest, for all kinds of political and cultural reasons, of going after the super high rate of male mortality, because that would require going after alcoholism. And they're simply not able to do that and maintain political stability.
We are just about out of time, and I certainly want to thank our panelists. It's been a very interesting discussion, and oftentimes I think you see a hearing or a briefing on Capitol Hill packaged in such a way that there's a message to get out or a preconceived notion, and I can honestly say this was one where pure interest in education and in creating a U.S. government product, the transcript, in the open source that people can draw on. There is no CRS ready-made product on Islam in Russia. It's certainly not the most important or the most pressing question that the U.S. government deals with it, but it's an interesting one, and it's gaining relevance. The products I know of are classified, and they aren't even that extensive. So to have a discussion like this as a start to advance the ball a bit, and again, in Russia, you go closer to the source. There's not a whole lot of readily accessible knowledge. And you look at our sources and things we rely on, journalists and NGOs, well, anyone who's read the newspaper even recently knows that, that's a very dangerous profession, particularly in the North Caucasus. And the voices are being silenced. The number of people who report out of that region dropped off sharply, scared out of the business or killed. You know, and for U.S. For us to travel to the region, official U.S. government travel to Dagestan, incredibly rare. Incredibly rare, and when it happens to those regions, it happens under the same conditions it would happen in Iraq or Afghanistan. Literally with, not simply with bulletproof vehicles, but armored vehicles and armed escorts, and makes it obviously very difficult to say, get out to the regions and talk to the people. And, so it's an area that is fascinating and very difficult to understand, and questions like terrorism, foreign influence, narcotics trade, trafficking, whatever question you might want to add as an interest, let alone obviously U.S. interest in values and human rights and fundamental freedoms, very difficult to get a grip on. Whether those things are issues or are not issues in the absence of any discussion. And you know, a region like Dagestan that was mentioned quite a bit today, we held a briefing earlier this year in Dagestan. And this is a region with at least 30 major ethnicities and different languages. And I mean, wrapping your mind around it is really quite something. Trying to, and often we're being fed simply the news headline that something happened there, somebody was killed there, or the police station was attacked, or a journalist was murdered, but not having any notion of the basis on, you know, what is this place, Dagestan, or the North Caucasus, or Karabakh-Balkaria, Karachay-Cherkessia. Can't hard to even say these names. So I am happy that our witnesses came and gave us these very interesting presentations, and I thank you, the audience, for participation. The transcript will be up shortly, and for future Helsinki Commission events, please visit our website, csce.gov. We will hopefully have a very robust schedule starting in January. Thank you all, and the briefing is adjourned.